Forum Communications, the producer of this fine podcast, has been publishing and supporting local news across the Midwest for over 100 years, and they have named this week Trust Week. It's a week highlighting all that goes into covering local news to ensure we keep your trust. Local news is one of the best ways to stay connected to your community, so during Trust Week, you can get 50% off a new annual subscription to the Forum. Just visit inforum.news/half-off to get this special offer. That's inforum.news/half-off to get 50% off of local news from local reporters.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinzler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Always great to be here talking gardening.
I got a joke for you. What do you get if you pour boiling water down a rabbit hole?
I don't know what you get when you pour boiling water down a rabbit hole.
Hot cross bunnies.
I love it. Especially with Easter coming right around the corner, hot cross buns are an item.
Exactly. I thought it was seasonal, and I thought it would be a good way to kind of kick off one of the kind of our topic of the show, which is, we've talked about this for a couple weeks now, like the idea of, as they call them, old wives' tales, kind of some myths or some things related to gardening. Like we thought it would be fun to kind of talk about what's true, what's not true, what's fact, what's fiction, and maybe, as they say, bust some myths.
Yeah, especially with Pinterest and Facebook, there's a lot of things. It's easy to put stuff out there.
Yep.
And of course, I love the phrase old wives' tales.
Yeah.
Because I'm never quick to dismiss old wives' tales, because some of the best gardeners I've ever known have been old wives.
Right.
And of course, old husbands can have plenty of tales too. So it's kind of fun to talk about these tales or myths.
So we'll just jump right into it, and with another, speaking of Easter, another kind of Easter themed one. There's one that I've never heard of, and maybe it's more regional, maybe it's more of a southern thing, but you should always plant potatoes on Good Friday. True or false?
That is false, because usually we can't get a spade or a shovel or a rototiller in the ground on Good Friday, especially in our northern areas here, because the ground's just frozen. And of course, Good Friday does vary with the season. But now I have heard that ever since I was a boy, many old timers saying, plant potatoes on Good Friday. But of course, if Good Friday was really, really late in the season, well, maybe that would be workable. But it's interesting where that maybe arose. Of course, there are different religious connotations that some use, but also the concept that with root vegetables like potatoes, those who plant by the phase of the moon, sometimes you hear that. You plant by a certain moon phase. And root vegetables or crops, for those that follow that procedure, it's not been proven, but they plant in the dark of the moon. And of course, Easter is the first Sunday after the first full moon of spring. And so if you plant potatoes on Good Friday, usually it would be in the dark of the moon. So that may be where some of that came from. But in our area, we'd have a hard time planting potatoes on Good Friday.
It's not going to happen this year.
And I get a wonderful crop of potatoes, as most people do, by not following that, even if we could.
Another one, planting hot peppers next to sweet bell peppers affects the flavor of the bell pepper.
Oh, I love this, because, of course, we oftentimes hear that in order to get fruit, it needs to cross. Things have to cross. The pollen has to cross. But by planting those close to each other, sweet pepper, hot pepper, even if they could cross-pollinate, it only affects the seeds inside. It does not affect the fruit itself. So there's nothing to that myth.
How about another one? Planting cucumbers next to melons makes the melons taste like cucumbers. True or false?
That is false. We sometimes hear that if the weather is really cool, cool weather affects the flavor of melons. They just don't get as sweet. They maybe taste more cucumbery-like. So then the myth arises that, well, maybe I planted the cucumbers too close to melons. But no, even if they could, which they can't, cross-pollinate, it's the seeds inside that would be affected, and not the fruit itself. So nothing to that.
This was a weird one I came across. I've never heard this one before. Putting nails, hairpins, or pieces of metal, small pieces of metal, in the ground around plants will help them grow. True or false?
That is false, but there's an interesting concept behind that. Now, plants need iron. In fact, if they have iron deficiency, it can cause the leaves to be very yellow. It's a disorder we call iron deficiency chlorosis. So the concept is kind of neat. Well, maybe if I put metal down in there, it'll rust and make iron. But that iron is not in a form that is soluble for plants to take up. So kind of a nice try, but it doesn't work.
Yeah, you're better using either a granulated thing.
You
or
need to
mix it
use
with water.
an iron-type fertilizer.
Chelated
iron,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
That is in a form that roots can actually take up.
I have to use that around my maple tree. One of my maple trees does not get enough iron, so I have to put
That's
that
one
in.
of the classic that shows iron deficiency. So unfortunately, a bag of nails isn't going to help it.
And speaking of trees, let's talk. There's a lot of old wives' tales based around trees. One of which is you should add peat moss to the bottom of holes when planting trees and shrubs. True or false?
That is false. Now, it is interesting that sometimes our knowledge changes. I remember when I was a kid, the recommendations from reputable sources used to be to, in the bottom of a planting hole for a tree or shrub, mix in peat moss or composted manure or other compost because it would help those roots kind of find their way a little better. But when they actually did research on this, and the science behind it showed that if you amend that planting hole and put good stuff in it, the roots love it, but they don't want to go out into the natural soil.
They don't want to expand.
Exactly. They don't want to expand. And of course, roots have to go way, way out. They can't stay in that nicely amended soil. And so it actually adversely affects a tree or shrub if you amend that hole. So, so it's actually easier. Just you don't need to put anything down in the bottom. Just dig the hole, backfill with the natural soil, natural dirt that you dug out.
Another one, you should cover a pruning cut with paint or a sealer of some kind after you make that cut. True or false?
That is false. And it doesn't make it any easier because there are companies that produce pruning paint and pruning sealer on the market. So they're marketing products like that. But a pruning cut on a tree or shrub has to heal itself. There are healing tissues, healing cells that will compartmentalize and heal over that. And if we put pruning paints on it, it actually interferes with that natural healing process. And it can also keep a wet layer under that pruning paint, and that's when rotting can occur. So just do the prune at the proper spot, don't leave a stub, and then no need for pruning paints or sealers.
I've heard that, like, if you want to get rid of certain kinds of shrubs that are, big or woody and that are kind of invasive, if you want to get rid of them, cut them off and then actually paint over what's left, at the ground level to try that'll kind of help. That'll help kill it.
Right. If you paint over it with herbicide.
Herbicide, yeah. I should
works
say,
really well. Yeah.
But you want to keep that away from animals then or anything
exactly.
like that. Another one with trees is there's a couple ones here back to back these are myths that we'll see are true or false. Nothing grows under evergreen trees because the needles make the soil acidic. True or false?
That is false because what causes things not to grow well under an evergreen tree is because evergreen trees are really shallow rooted. And so the roots are close to the surface, and they take a lot of moisture. So if you've ever examined the soil under a spruce tree or a pine tree, it's almost powder dry because they've taken the moisture and the nutrients, so other things just have a hard time growing. The needles that drop from an evergreen tree at first are maybe a little bit acidic, but actually our soils could use acid because they're quite alkali. But anyway, the needles that drop are slightly acidic, but as they decompose, the acid disappears. So, yep, totally false. If something doesn't grow under an evergreen tree, it's not because it's become acid. It's because it's just too dry and the soil is kind of worn out. Is
there anything that you would suggest to grow under an evergreen tree? Because obviously also too, it would be very shady under there.
Right.
Are there anything that you would suggest, something that doesn't need, to have the deep roots that wouldn't compete with the roots of a shallow evergreen?
There are some shade-loving ground covers, so check local garden centers for shade-loving ground covers. And then we need to do things that will improve that soil underneath. Maybe incorporate peat moss. This would be a good use for peat moss or compost. Put that in to give a little more moisture holding capacity into that upper layer of soil, and then also mulch. Use a wood product type mulch around the plants that you use.
All right. Okay, another one about trees that are hard to grow things around. Nothing grows around a black walnut tree. True or false?
That is mostly true because black walnut is a rare tree species. I mean, not rare because it doesn't grow here, but I mean, it's unusual tree species because the roots exude, and also the leaves and stems, exude a compound called juglone. It's a self-preservation mechanism for black walnut. They exude this so that other things won't grow around it and compete. So they exude this chemical into the soil, and so many types of things have great difficulty growing around it. For example, tomatoes, potatoes, things like that. If you have a garden in the root zone area of a black walnut, you have a hard time growing some of these things. So that is mostly true. There are some species of plants that are a little more tolerant of that. But if you do a quick online search of what can and cannot grow around a black walnut, you'll get the list.
Yeah, sounds. I suppose you could.
Interesting species.
Yeah, you probably could, though, put in some above ground things, like if you had a planter or something like that, as long as the leaves didn't fall into it, right?
Exactly. If the roots of what you want to plant are not growing in the soil affected by the roots of black walnut, an above ground planter would be a good example of something that you could get to grow under a black walnut.
Yeah.
As long as it tolerates the shade, etc.
And then, kind of getting back to another one of
black walnuts are beautiful trees, by the way.
They are gorgeous.
Wonderful trees.
Getting back to the idea, we talked about this a little bit before. If you need 2 apple trees to get fruit. We talked a little bit about this kind of cross-pollination, but any truth behind that you need two apple trees to get fruit? There
is, but there's a but. And of course, oftentimes you will hear that we need 2 apple trees. But 2 apple trees of the same cultivar cannot cross-pollinate and get fruit production. For example, 2 Haralson are not going to work. 2 Honeycrisp are not going to work. It's got to be 2 different named cultivars for that cross-pollination that will result in fruit. Now, they don't have to both be in the same yard. If you only have room for 1 apple tree, maybe your neighbor has a different type of apple tree. That'll work. Also, flowering ornamental crab apples. They will cross-pollinate fruiting apple varieties. Bees will travel a little distance, too.
Will there, if you have a different kind of fruit, like could you have a nectarine tree next to an apple tree? Would that work?
Good question. No, it needs to be apple, crab apple. So a plum will not work with an apple. And the same case is true with plums. You need 2 different named plum cultivars in order to cross-pollinate. But interesting question. Yeah, the plum won't work with the apple, et cetera. Pear won't cross with an apple. So interesting question on fruits.
A lot of good information here, Don. We're going to take a quick little break. When we kind of come back, we're going to talk about one people's favorite thing to grow, tomatoes. And with tomatoes, there's a lot of urban legends with that.
There is, yeah. And that is America's #1 homegrown vegetable.
Well, we'll be back with some truth and some facts, some truth and not truths about that.
If you're loving this podcast, be sure to check out our full lineup. From news and local politics to sports and true crime, find your next great listen right now at inforum.com/podcasts. That's inforum.com/podcasts.
Okay, we're back, and we're going to talk tomatoes and some of the urban legends, the old wives' tales about tomatoes, and what's true and false when it comes to the advice about tomatoes. So, Don, you ready?
I'm ready.
And this is one that you brought up, the one that you hear a lot about. Tums, the antacid, will keep your tomatoes from developing blossom end rot. True or false?
That is false. Now, the idea, I can see where some of these things come about because Tums are high in calcium, and blossom end rot of tomatoes, which causes a brown, sunken, blackish thing on the bottom of a tomato fruit, is caused by lack of calcium. So you'd think, well, maybe throw a couple of Tums in. I think this is where it originated. Throw a couple of high calcium Tums in the bottom of planting hole, and the calcium problem will be solved. But our soils are plentiful in calcium, so adding calcium to it doesn't help. It's not the problem. But tomato roots can't access the soil calcium if the moisture level is fluctuating. See, the calcium has to be in a liquid form for the roots to soak it up. And in order to be in a liquid form, the soil moisture has to be adequate. So if the soil gets dry, then the roots can't take up that calcium. And tomatoes are really sensitive to this calcium situation. So we need to keep our tomato plants, the root system, the soil, more uniformly moist. So watch the watering, water a little more, and mulch the soil to keep it uniform. Then the roots will be able to take up that calcium out of the soil that's there naturally. So we don't need to add any more. In fact, if you add too much calcium, you can cause a dangerous situation.
Blossom end rot certainly is one of the big hindrances, the big problems that gardeners...
That's probably a number one problem on tomatoes.
Yeah, that or squirrels that only take one bite out of them.
True.
They're awful. So there's another question about blossom end rot, and that is Epsom salt will help prevent
Yes, you see this
end rot.
commonly advocated on Facebook and Pinterest, Epsom salts.
True or false?
That is false.
Okay.
Absolutely false. In fact, this is one of the things that can cause danger. You know, some of these things you think, well, is it really going to do any harm? Epsom salt can actually cause harm and cause the problem to get worse because Epsom salt is magnesium. And again, we mentioned that the problem is calcium. So applying magnesium in Epsom salts can actually cause the calcium to be even tied up even further. It causes a nutrient imbalance. So no Epsom salts.
With blossom end rot, one of the things that I heard when we first started planting tomatoes was that maybe our tomatoes were too low to the soil and then would get wet when we watered, or that they would water the leaves and then everything would get wet. Any truth to that? That causes blossom end rot, or is it all blossom end rot coming in from the roots?
Blossom end rot comes in from the roots, but there is some truth to what you say because other actual type diseases, such as fungus type diseases, see, the blossom end rot is just a disorder of the plant. It's not actually a disease organism, but other type of diseases, such as the foliage type diseases, those are caused by fungus and bacteria. And so those can be carried by splashing water as well. And so there's truth to keep don't water the leaves, prevent splashing. So that will help on some of the other disorders.
Now, a lot of people like a nice sweet tomato. I mean, not too sweet, but you want to bite in. You want some of that. And so one of the old wives' tales out there is sugar and baking soda in the soil will help make your tomatoes sweeter. True or false?
That is false. It's kind of a neat idea. You add sugar to the soil and get sweeter tomatoes.
Spoonful of sugar.
Yeah, exactly. But tomatoes need to build their sugars through photosynthesis and the plant process. They don't take the sugars up by the roots. And so, it doesn't work. And also the baking soda is high in calcium, and we don't need that additional calcium in the soil. So, no, that doesn't work. Now, this is maybe a good point, too, to bring up the fact that sometimes what we do doesn't always have a direct correlation to the end result. Okay, for example, if someone puts Epsom salt on their tomatoes and said, I never have blossom end rot, it doesn't mean that the Epsom salt is
the cure.
What worked. Yeah. Exactly. Their soil is probably nicely moist. So sometimes if somebody insists that one of these works, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you follow me, the end result isn't necessarily a product of what they did. And so some of these things, that's what can be dangerous. For example, in the case of the Epsom salts, it can actually cause things to go wrong.
And if you're looking for a sweet tomato, the best thing to do really is to find a variety that is labeled as a sweet tomato. That's
absolutely
in the
true, because
description.
they do differ in flavor, the amount of acidity, the amount of sugar. So yes, the cultivar depends greatly on the amount of sugar and sweetness and flavor.
And what would you say? I know you turned me on to sun sugars. Sun sugars are a delicious, wonderful
little cherry.
What are some other
tomato.
ones that are good sweet tomatoes that you can think of?
Well, I like Big Beef.
Okay.
That's a great one. Celebrity is a good one. And everyone's got their own favorite. But the other thing that really helps with good, sweet, flavorful tomatoes is the year. They love full sun. They love good warmth, not too hot, not too cold, but the growing season will have a great effect. So the cultivar, choose a good one, and then also the growing season has to cooperate.
So along the lines of Tums and Epsom salt, I saw one that was aspirin is good for plants. Plant an aspirin in the ground, and that will help plants grow. True or false?
That's false. Aspirin, of course, is fairly acidic, and it would take a whole lot of aspirin to acidify our alkaline-type soil. So, no, we can skip the aspirin. Save it for a headache.
Save it for a headache, exactly. So while we're talking about planting, let's talk about fertilizer and soil treatments. Back to Epsom salts again. Epsom salt works as a fertilizer. True or false?
That is false. The only time that would possibly be used was if a soil test indicated that you were low in magnesium, and our soils have plenty of magnesium. So generally that could be very dangerous to put Epsom salt on as a fertilizer.
And this is a widely spread one, but banana peels are good in the ground. Or, you can throw them into the ground and are good, especially around rose bushes. True or false?
That's true. Bananas are an organic product that'll decompose really, really well down into our soil. So, and adding organic material to our soils, whether it's heavy clay or a sand, organic matter is the product that we should be using. So banana peels, yes, absolutely.
Is there anything in particular in banana peels that make them better than other things?
They will probably reduce, and I'd have to check what the exact analysis is of that, but they'll be a slow release of some elements also into the soil. So yeah, absolutely, banana peels.
Along that line, used coffee grounds can be used in the soil around for vegetable gardens and flower gardens. True or false?
That is true. It's fun to do some of these that are actually true and not just always be negative that things don't work. But yeah, absolutely. Coffee grounds. My mom always put coffee grounds out around her outdoor plants and also house plants. Some are concerned about what about the acidity, but the acidity ends up in the coffee that we drink. The coffee grounds actually don't have that much acidity left in them, and our soils could actually use a little acidifying. But coffee grounds are good organic material. They're fairly low in nitrogen, low fertilizer, but every bit helps. So, yep, absolutely yes to the coffee grounds.
And speaking of kind of another grainy, gritty mixture that some people use, some people will say sand, add sand to heavy soil to lighten it up. True or false?
That is false. The reason for that is heavy soil high in clay. Clay plus sand makes brick. And so you can actually, by adding sand to heavy clay soil, make the situation worse. You'll create brick instead of loosening it up. So the cure for heavy clay soil is organic matter. That will help make it more mellow.
So something like, again, peat moss?
Yeah, peat moss, compost.
Okay.
You can make your
Manure.
own compost. Yep, manure. Grass clippings that have not been treated with chemicals.
Okay.
That composted makes a really good material.
All right. And since we're talking about adding things to soils in pots, one of the big things that I've always heard too is you can put rocks in the bottom of your flower pots. That'll help both drainage and then also help fill up the flower pot so you don't need to put in as much soil. True or false?
That is false. The use of rocks in the bottom of pots is false. Now, I'll talk about that just a little more in depth. Now, my mom always put rocks in the bottom of her houseplant pots, and her plants grew beautifully. But the problem after they'd done research with this, what happens when you water a flower pot with rocks in the bottom? The water goes down through the potting mix, and then it pauses at that layer of change, and it supersaturates the potting mix above before the excess will go out. So it actually makes the potting mix maybe a little too wet.
Oh.
But now, my mom was a great plant person, so she knew not to overwater her plants. But rocks in the bottom can make it overwatering worse. So we can save ourselves the time and not put that layer of rocks in the bottom for our house plants. But now you mentioned other things like in the bottom of, especially maybe outside containers. Mm-hmm. What if you've got a great big, huge container outside, maybe, 2 or 3 feet in diameter and 3 feet deep? That's going to take a lot of potting mix.
Right.
Is it okay to put things in the bottom like old pop bottles or old milk jugs to take up some space? Some people use packing peanuts, styrofoam packing peanuts. And yes, outside, out there, yes, if you need to take up some space, make sure you have at least 18 inches of soil for plants to grow in, but you can tie up some of that space. Now, I mentioned when water gets that layer of change, it'll kind of supersaturate the soil. But outdoors, overwatering isn't usually a problem. the problem outdoors is usually keeping our containers wet enough in the sun and the heat and the wind. So outdoors, yes, we can take up some of that space in a pot. Indoors for houseplants, no, don't put anything in the bottom of the pot.
So what would you recommend? You said like plastic bottles, or you said
People are quite creative. Old pop cans,
okay,
milk jugs.
Would you use metal or would you use plastic? I mean, is there an issue of degrading?
Either will work, yeah.
Okay.
The idea is mostly just to take up some space so you don't have quite as much soil needed. Because really we only need 18 inches to 2 feet of soil in even a very large container.
And I suppose if you're just talking about using it just for that growing season, because you want to have that soil out at the end of the growing season so it doesn't freeze and expand and smash the pot.
Right, especially if it's a breakable container.
Yeah, so you want to clean it out anyway. So you're going to be pulling out whatever it is you put in the bottom of there.
Right, you need to pull out
they really won't have
plants.
time to decompose, will they?
Exactly.
All right. Well, we're going to take another quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about everyone's least favorite gardening chore, weeding, and some people's ideas for quick hacks and some other old wives' tales that go along with weeding.
When you can't make it to City Hall or the school board meetings, local journalists from Inforum.com will be there to report the facts and get your questions answered. Local news works for you. Stay up to date at Inforum.com.
Okay, we're back and we're talking some old wives' tales in the garden. What works, what doesn't work, what's true, what's false, what's fact, what's fiction. And with weeds, there are a fair amount of nobody really likes going out and weeding. So people are always looking for solutions. Plus the other idea too is that people, especially with some weeds, people don't want to use, chemicals. So some people come up with what they think are home remedies or
more natural type remedies.
More natural things. And some of them work, some of them may not. So let's jump into this. Pouring boiling water over weeds will stop them, will kill them. True or false?
It will burn them back naturally, but it will not always kill the root. So if it's a perennial type weed that has a root that just lives and lives and lives and can overwinter, boiling water will fry off the top, but it will not always kill the root. Sometimes there will be enough root that'll be long lasting. So if I was going to try to do the boiling water thing, maybe on a crack in the sidewalk or something, I would not put boiling water on soil in which you're growing things, because then you're
not in your lawn.
Yeah, I would not. No, because that will kill the surrounding grass as far as the temperature will reach of the boiling. And then also you're killing some of the organisms, probably the beneficial organisms in soil.
Plus, you're carrying around boiling water. If you're taking that from inside the house to the outside, I'm kind of a klutz. I know I would burn myself, so I'm not going to go that way. Another one is vinegar. Spraying vinegar or using Dawn dish soap on weeds will kill them. True or false?
We see that a lot, and false. That is not something that we should be using. Now, for a couple of reasons, and of course, Penn State University did a lot of research on this. And for one thing, the vinegar in it it'll burn down the top of the weed, but that's not always translocated through the root. And so perennial weeds like quackgrass, dandelions will probably come back again. And also, because it's such a kind of a caustic type material, you're interfering with the beneficial earthworms in the ground, the other beneficial bacteria and fungi in the ground, you're interfering with those. So that's not a recommended. I know some people use it, some people swear by it, but it's not a recommended potion.
And like we said, weeding is hardly anybody's favorite thing to do in the garden. What's your approach to weeding? Because some people have a very regimented approach where they will go out every morning and do it, just like when the sun's coming up, and as a way to they feel it's a good way to get the day started. They've accomplished something, and it's kind of relaxing. Other people break it up into different chunks or do it a certain day of the week. What's your approach to weeding?
I actually don't mind weeding, and I have two approaches. In the vegetable garden or the flower garden, get them when they're little, when they're teeny. In the vegetable garden, hoe them out when they're just teeny, and actually it becomes kind of fun. If they get ahead of you, then that's a nightmare. So in the vegetable garden. In the rest of the landscape, like you mentioned, take a walk around each evening or every other evening. look for the weeds. And I use just a knife, cut them down far enough down below, and that works quite well. And it allows me to appreciate the whole landscape. It gives me a reason to walk around and enjoy everything. It's peaceful, calming. I see all the flowers blooming, the shrubs, and when I see a weed, then I tackle that one.
What kind of a knife do you use? Just like a plain butter knife, or do you use
a butter knife or an old butcher knife that maybe has a little longer blade on it?
So something with some depth that you can
exactly,
because you really want to get the whole root.
Right, because many of the weeds that pop up like dandelions or quack or thistles, you need to get down quite a ways. And some of them are going to regrow, but with persistence, we can out-persist those.
Now, speaking of things to do every day or in the morning, another daily chore, or maybe a daily chore, watering is something that people have lots of advice on. Some of it may not always be good. One is watering midday is bad for plants and will burn the leaves. True or false?
Well, that is false. Where that comes from is the idea that water droplets on a leaf will magnify, the sun will magnify and burn. But that's not really the case. But there is a good case. There's a different case for not watering in midday. Not because it'll burn the leaves, but because that's the time when the water's going to evaporate. And so we're kind of wasting the water. We should water, the preferred is early morning, maybe between 4 and 6 a.m. Would be the preferred time to water. So sometimes there's truth, but for a different reason.
What about watering at night? I heard that watering once it gets dark is bad for things. True or false?
Yeah, well, that is bad. It's true that it's bad. How about that? I had to think about that for a minute. It's true that that's bad. Watering at night or in the evening, you would think that would be good because there's less evaporation and it would soak down. And from that aspect, that does work. But if leaves, including lawn grass or vegetable garden leaves, if they stay wet all night, that is a perfect spot for disease organisms to start. And because it stay wet all night like that. And so that's a way to make our disease problems worse. So that's why watering just before dawn or early morning, so the water will still penetrate down in. It won't evaporate right away. But pretty soon the sun will come up, dry the foliage so that we have less disease. So that's the reason that the early morning is the preferred instead of evening or night.
And if you have to water, if you forgot to water in the morning, what's the latest you should do it? Or are we talking before dusk then?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, before dusk. And if you do need to water during the day, sometimes you think, oh my gosh, this is going to need watering. Yeah, absolutely. But water the soil. Don't water overhead where more evaporation is going to. But water the soil, soak it deeply, water kind of slowly so it'll penetrate in. And that's why mulching helps greatly too.
Do you have one of those watering wands, the longer wands?
Exactly. That's what I use, a watering wand attached to the hose with a nozzle at the end so I can direct the water right down at the base of plants where it's needed.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about another unfavorite thing to deal with is pests in the garden. Human hair will keep rabbits out of the garden. True or false?
That is false. Rabbits and deer, you see this sometimes promoted as a way to keep deer out, but especially in urban situations, rabbits and deer are so used to the human scent that human hair doesn't keep them away. I suppose it might be worth a try on an isolated farmstead out there where they just aren't used to humans, but generally, no, that's been proven to be false. It just does not work.
Marigolds. Do marigolds keep rabbits and deer away?
No. In fact, rabbits will eat marigolds, and deer, if they get hungry enough, they'll eat marigolds too. I've seen it with my own eyes. Now, the idea, I can see where it arises because marigolds are quite aromatic. They have quite a scent. Some people like it, some people hate it. But if rabbits and deer are hungry enough, not only will that not deter them, but they'll actually eat them.
Brings us up to insects. Are there plants? I've heard some plants will keep mosquitoes away, in particular rosemary. Some very fragrant herbs maybe will keep bugs and mosquitoes away. True or false?
There is truth to that. But oftentimes there's a but, isn't there?
Yeah.
There is truth to that. There are geraniums that are called mosquito geraniums or mosquito plants, and they have kind of a citronella type fragrance to them. So the plants that are touted for insect control, such as mosquitoes or other garden insects, are very fragrant, very aromatic. And there is some truth to that, but here's the but. In order for those to effectively keep insects away, whether it's on your deck and mosquitoes or out in the vegetable garden, the number of plants has to be so great, because there's a huge air mass around. And for a plant to actually exude enough stuff to fill that air space with this repellent type fragrance, you would need so many, many plants. So in most cases, you just can't get enough plants around to make it effective. So there's a little bit of truth, but the but is we usually do not have enough plants around to make it effective.
Okay. Keeping with insect repellent, dish soap makes for a good insecticide. True or false?
Oftentimes, that is false. And here's the reason. Oftentimes a person sees shared on Facebook or Pinterest that Dawn dish soap, et cetera, other brands of dish soap can be used on house plants or other plants.
Mixed in with water.
Exactly. And here's the problem. Here's why that can be dangerous. Most of those dishwashing soaps have degreasers in, and plant leaves have the natural wax called a cuticle that protects those leaves. And if we use a degreasing type dish soap, it destroys that natural waxy cuticle, and so it can actually harm the plants. Now, garden centers sell insecticidal soap. Kind of sounds like dishwashing soap, but it's different. It's a special plant-friendly soap that does not destroy the waxy coating on leaves. So it'll effectively control some insects without harming plants.
All right. Natural insecticides are safe. True or false? And this is kind of a broad thing, but let's talk about it.
Sometimes a person would think, well, okay, a natural insecticide, natural should be good, should be safe.
Sure.
That is false. Because some of the insecticides, the classic one is called pyrethrum. It's derived naturally from chrysanthemum plants. So you think, well, gosh, anything coming kind of from a plant base should be kind of safe. But pyrethrum, derived from that, can be very toxic to humans, can be toxic to beneficial insects if used inappropriately. So even a natural type product needs to be used with caution.
Something that a lot of us in gardens have to deal with in the summer, slugs. Beer will attract slugs away from plants and help kill them. True or false?
That is true. And of course, this one's been around for a long time. So if you put beer in a tray and then sink the tray down to ground level so that slugs can access the tray of beer, they will crawl in and drown. Now, it's debatable because, I always enjoy saying this one. It does work, but does it attract slugs from miles around for free beverages? I doubt it, but it can control slugs. Other options too, there are slug baits that are sold at garden centers, or you can put down a piece of cardboard or a board in the evening, wet the soil down first. And then the slugs, of course, do their work at night. And then in the early morning, before the sun comes up, they're looking for a cool, moist spot to hide. And they will congregate under that board or cardboard that you've put. So then after the sun comes up and after we're up, just lift up that board or cardboard and see all the slugs underneath, and then just scrape them off, sprinkle them with salt. That's a fairly good way to control slugs, is you catch them.
I suppose one of the other drawbacks about putting beer or something in your garden, besides the fact that you don't want pets to get into them, but then maybe they could attract bees or wasps or hornets too, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that may be
dangerous. It's really not something that I don't use it to control slugs. I use the boards, cardboard, or the slug bait sold at the garden center.
Now, these are kind of some more kind of insect repellent ones. Using a methanol rub on a bird feeder will keep bees and bugs away. True or false? Have you ever heard this one?
I have no idea.
See, even we're learning something on this one.
I have no idea on that. But I think it would be worth a try. Isn't one of the physician's oaths, a doctor's oath, one of those that you hear is first do no harm?
Right.
So if something isn't going to do any harm, well, then, it might not do any harm. So I don't see any harm in rubbing menthol rub to keep the insects away. So, yeah, I've got nothing on that.
Okay.
How's that?
How about this one? A bag of pennies filled with water will keep flies away. True or false?
That's false. There's really nothing in it. Now, I can see where some of these things arise because copper, there is a copper compound that's an effective fungicide. But it's a copper form that can be applied to plants. And so just pennies and water are not going to provide that same copper compound that can be used as a repellent or as a fungicide.
So now another sometimes unwanted guest, ants. One thing is a chalk line can dissuade ants from marching through a particular area in the yard or garden. True or false?
That I'm going to waffle on this one because there's not a whole lot of research on that. I can see where it maybe arose because ants don't like to crawl across things that kind of get on them, and chalk would kind of make a gritty type stuff on their body. So I can see where that might occur, but I don't have a definitive answer on that. But again, I see no harm in putting a chalk line to see if it would prevent ants.
The problem
so I
with
see no harm in that one other than
it's not going to be a permanent fix because
exactly,
obviously
rainwater
will take it away. And plus, ants are persistent. They are orderly, but they will find another way around that.
Exactly.
And a big thing with ants, a big one, is ants are necessary to help peonies bloom. True or false?
False, absolutely false. And this one was really, really easy to come up with the research as to why this doesn't work. All that the researchers had to do was grow a peony in a closed-in environment in a greenhouse in which you absolutely exclude ants, and the peonies open beautifully. The reason ants are oftentimes seen in association with peonies is because peony buds have a very sweet, sticky item on the sweet, sticky surface. And so ants are attracted to that. So oftentimes you see ants and peony buds in close association, but neither needs the other. Peonies will open just fine without ants. If a peony does not open, if the buds form and doesn't open, usually it's a disease called botrytis. Blight is the most common cause. So the ants aren't doing any harm, but they are not helping the peony either.
And if you want your peonies are of course big and beautiful. If you want those in your house, the best thing to do is you make your cut, you bring the flower, you dunk it in a little water, right? And then you can dunk the head of the flower in a little water. It'll wash off the ants.
So that your dining room table isn't all full of ants.
Right.
Once you bring
exactly. So you can put other good food on the table.
It's interesting. Some of these, that ants and the peony, that's been around since I was a boy, that myth that they're required, which they're not.
Okay, Don, that was a lot of fun. We're talking about a lot of things that what's true and false in the old wives' tale realm in the garden. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, this has been fun. And what makes this really interesting, sometimes when we try something like this and say, well, gosh, it worked really, really well, like mothballs around my garden, kept the rabbits out. But then the next person will try it and it doesn't work. By the way, mothballs haven't been shown to work very well either. And so I can see why some of these get perpetuated because it might seem to work for somebody, but again, the cause and effect aren't necessarily related.
Causation.
For example, I've got a good one in my own situation. I've got no rabbits this year. And so I had put out a little repellent this year, and so I might think, wow, that repellent really worked. That was effective. But, and I shared this on Facebook, there's a coyote in our backyard. Yeah. I've took a photo of a coyote, and it's got rabbits. And I do not see rabbit tracks anymore. So anyway, I can't give the rabbit repellent the credit.
Right.
The coyote. And if I hadn't seen that coyote with my own eyes, I might have thought that repellent. Yeah. So it makes fascinating discussion.
Well, we want to thank everybody who wrote in with questions or shared their own old wives' tale and wanted some kind of definitive answers. So we really appreciate that. And Don, if people have questions for you, what's the best way to reach you?
Yeah, give me an email. Send me photos along with it if you'd like. And best way is to email me, donald.kinzler@ ndsu.edu.
Okay, well, that's another episode of Growing Together, a gardening podcast. I'm John Lamb.
And Don Kinzler.
And we'll talk to you next week.
Have a great week.